in December of '77, there's an ad in Dragon magazine for the Monster Manual.
Yeah.
Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is actually out on the scene. I want to mention, D&D of course started in 1974 with Dave Arneson, who, in my opinion, doesn't get nearly enough credit, and Gary Gygax. So not to take anything away from him, but D&D was, the intersection of theater games and war games, storytelling type games and tactical battle games. And Dave Arneson introduced the concept of dungeon crawls and dungeon masters and things like that. But with AD&D, things went to this whole other level.
Yeah. They kind of turned it up to 11. I mean, for races and classes get separated out so that now you can choose a race and a class instead of being locked into one. You have many more attributes, many more character classes available. It's just moving from a very kind of tiny, focused abstract into, hey, I really can be just about anybody I want to be in this world. There's so many options available, and you take those and you analog those abilities you have into numbers, and really that becomes important later on, as this is going to make a transference into video games in a few years that's vital. This is the beginning of taking something you want to be, turning it into a number, and then gradually working that into a computer, into what becomes
not just that concept, but the very labels we use, right? Like paladins and druids are part of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. They're part of the supplements that Dave Arneson wrote. Right. And when you play World of Warcraft and you want to be a druid, you can thank Dave Arneson for coming up with that.
That's the archetype.
But also, it expanded just sort of geek culture in a way, and it made it something that the outside world really took up and took notice of, and it became, it's still to this day, it's kind of like a shorthand for, whether you're referring to somebody as a fanboy or a geek or whatever, but it's got a sort of, it broadened the horizons, and I feel like almost helped create, kind of like Star Trek and Star Wars did, but a sense of community amongst fans too.
Exactly.
Like, hey, there's somebody else who's into this stuff, and
it's like a secret language.
It really
an
did
alignment
open it
tongue,
up.
you might say.
You'll also, it's to the point where it's so ubiquitous, it's easy to just discount its influence. But things like ability scores, right?
Exactly.
Like having an 18 in strength or being under, represented in another ability score, that's D&D. This is the system that I think popularized that idea, and it's virtually it's so many places today that it's like a fish being wet.
It literally gamified fantasy, and after that, it went into sci-fi and it went into horror games, and we would not probably have the video game industry today without those original tabletops.
In a year when fantasy and science fiction ruled popular culture, this gave you and your friends a way to dive into your own imaginary universe and create your own stories and tell them in a new and exciting way.
Well, so it was always great for me as a kid. My best friend had 3 brothers, and they actually had a big basement, and we always had a built-in group to be able to play AD&D, to go over there, and we would create our own stories, and we had our books of characters, because we would just make characters because it was fun to make a character, even without the story, right? So it was just a great learning and imaginative experience.
It's interesting you mentioned alignment tongues. That's another thing that we got out of AD&D was, we play Mass Effect and you make the Paragon Renegade choice. That was something that D&D popularized. That was a format that they created.
And you end up with that complex alignment grid in AD&D that lets you think, being good and evil is not the same as being lawful and chaotic. Now we can, hey, there are good people that don't like order, and there are bad people that don't necessarily enjoy chaos. And that's another thing.
Darth Vader is the great example, right? Like very authoritarian, but also doesn't really care if he happens to run over you to get what he wants. Let's talk specifically about the Monster Manual. What I really loved about the Monster Manual, the thing that spoke to me the same way that sort of science meets faith / mysticism in Star Wars, was this amazing combination of math and myth, right? Like numbers and stats and real crunchy stuff, but also with centaurs and pegasuses and dwarves and things like that.
It's basically like it's like when you get like sports cards with player stats, but meets a bestiary from the Middle Ages.
Exactly.
It's like how many games does that dragon win? Kind of
Absolutely,
thing,
That iconic art as well too. I just remember as a kid going into the bookstore and seeing those, and as bad as some of the art looks today, just being amazed by it, seeing that unicorn with the beard, or seeing that big red dragon flying over, or seeing that owlbear just from a side profile.
Once again, inspiring an entire generation of drawings on Trapper Keepers.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that art, that art was bad, most of it, but it's bad in a wonderfully, lovingly rendered way.
And the graph paper industry was probably saved by...
You mentioned going to bookstores, and that's really interesting. I'm going to dig into that a little bit, because we take for granted today that there are gaming stores and hobby shops, and in San Francisco there are quite a few, and sort of in the greater Bay Area.
Or
there
that
are
you
a
could
bunch.
buy everything online.
Yeah, or that you can buy everything. But you had to go to a
Yeah.
boutique store to actually find that monster manual. And I remember seeing it in Chapel Hill when my dad was on a business trip, and I went with him. And I saw this, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Like I've been looking for this book a long time, and here it finally is.
You used to have to go to like model shops. Like,
Yeah,
I don't
exactly,
want
a
to
lot.
train. I don't want to get some World War II plane. Where's,
Can you imagine like trying to find a D12 in 1977? Like it was not the easiest thing in the world. You had to order it by mail.
You had to whittle your own.
Turn to the back of your
Whittle your own.
magazine, send real money in a real envelope to an address, and wait 6 weeks, and then your die would come in the mail.
So I don't want to discount. 77 also saw the release of Traveller, which I think is hugely influential in the RPG community. But D&D specifically, went on to dominate RPGs throughout the 80s, contributed to a massive explosion in RPGs. Tons of games that I know we've all played and enjoyed quite a bit.
AD&D is the reason your grandmother is afraid of demons and dragons, but it's also
My grandmother actually played D&D with me once.
that's awesome.
I got her to be a cleric, and I pushed that sort of like religious angle just to get some buy-in from her.
She went to confession right after. I'm
Right.
sure, yeah.
I grew up in the South. We didn't have a lot of Catholics where I lived. You and I are from different parts of the country. Yeah.